the other side. It was quite a bit of the stuff that they were dealing with against the Parthians. It would have been the Sassanids probably by then. And so there was a moment that all of the history geeks like yours truly love to play around with. And it's almost like when the Russians and the Allied forces meet up and shake hands in the Second World War. You have this meeting of the Imperial Romans and the Han Chinese meeting over somewhere in Central Asia. But to me, that would be an example of an interesting first contact, because unlike the Mongol version of it, which wasn't really first contact, but we know what we mean, or the New World one, Han China and Imperial Rome at that time period, that's not a mismatch. That would be an interesting sort of balance of power question right there, right? So that's two undefeated heavyweight champions from other divisions finding each other. So now I'm geeking out over that in my mind.
It's amazing how trade networks cause things to happen and bring things in places you would never expect. Like Roman jewelry ended up in Japanese grave sites and burials. And there's a village in, I think, Western China that claims some of its inhabitants are descended from Roman soldiers.
The Roman legionaries. Yeah. From the Crassus debacle, right? Wasn't it that? I think it was the Parthian Crassus debacle, the Lost Legion or something. The Lost Cohort.
Right. And then we have more Western features. So that definitely proves it, because we're undiluted for 2,000 years.
Well, and like that whole area hasn't had a ton of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, red-headed, green-eyed people forever, going back to the first Chinese records about the place. And the Ti and the Rung, who were the proto-Scythian peoples before there were horses in the region, were supposed, the Tocharians and all those other remember the Chinese had a problem not that long ago with a Caucasian mummy that was in a rather unfortunate place from the standpoint of their ideology, because it's supposed to be Chinese territory, and then you find these mummies from people who had very a Western-looking skin. But once upon a time, I always tell my listeners, once upon a time, people were all spread out in pockets in all kinds of fun places for a long time. And you could find that was what made Genghis Khan such a fun person to try to reconstruct his features, because there's not a lot of descriptions. But when you know this when you're talking about even the Ottomans, they would run in, you had your occasional Turk that shows up with the red hair and the green eyes again, or I always liked that woman. And I'm old enough to remember this. It was a famous cover from the National Geographic, and it showed a woman from like Afghanistan or something. And she has the traditional features that you would associate with the region, but she's got these incredible bright blue or bright green eyes. And it was always such a reminder to all of us that people get around, right? And that these kinds of physical features have been mixed with people that we don't even associate with them being mixed with now. And with Genghis Khan, you could mix features of a person who looks East Asian with green eyes, with a beard color that looks more like what a Russian would have in the West. Any kind of ethnic combination becomes possible. And so, I love that whole idea of how everyone moves around life. I don't even remember the point. I love the idea so much.
Well, I like that too, because it's the cracks in official histories, especially national histories, that we're all monolithically this way, but you'll always find exceptions and always find cracks and people who are there who shouldn't be there. And yeah, I love seeing those things too. Absolutely.
I have a counter question for you. Don't you think it's intriguing to watch something that I would have thought was going the way of the dinosaur, that whole, like you were saying, the nationalistic sort of histories, because it's on a resurgence in many places all over the world. Just watching the Russians both reclaim their legitimate history, but also Davy Crocketify it also, just like, all these countries that are rewriting their histories with a more nationalistic flair, it almost seems like they're going back to a way we did history 40 or 50 or 60 years ago in like the 1950s high school textbook version of it, just their country's version of that.
Yeah, it's funny when you're looking through the looking glass and you see on the other side, it can look silly. I spent a lot of years in Turkey, and they have a very nationalist historiography. And my period is around the era of the Armenian genocide. And I'm probably going to lose
You're lucky to be here, man.
Probably going to lose some Turkish listeners just by saying that. But hey, it is what it is. But it does, make question, what we have in our system too. But yeah, it's sort of like a bizarre 1950s version in some areas. Something I was thinking of that kind of got me thinking when you mentioned the Mongols, something you did really well in the series on the Mongols and then all of your series on the ancient world is you'll talk about these factors that hold true along long periods of history. You had mentioned the physics of the battlefield, that really until the 20th century, what it was like to be a soldier in combat could be very comparable to the ancient world when you don't have modern weapons, and getting into the shoes of the people who are there on the ground. And when you specifically talked about the Mongol slaughter of, I think it was Kiev or some city in Russia, or I'm not really sure, I can't remember, but that if you were in a helicopter, a news helicopter going overhead, what would it be like to see that? And what's your sense, kind of evoking that, of if you're on the ground, you have witnessed some type of total collapse, whether it's Mongols coming through and completely slaughtering almost everybody in a town, any type of devastating battle after Siege of Constantinople, 1453, take your pick, whatever. Is there anything that comes back to you and recurs to you? Wow, I get this sense of what it would be like to just stand there and see all this.
I feel like you have to read different kinds of things to get that sense that you're talking about, and then apply those things to the stories in the past. So I'll give you an example. If you read the various chroniclers, and they'll talk about the Mongols coming in and creating devastation or whatever they do, maybe talking about the fall of Baghdad, and the Islamic chroniclers would bemoan all the things that were happening, and you read this stuff, and there's a disconnect, and the disconnect is what goes away in time. Where these people in this story, you can in one sort of way feel for them, because that's what makes the story compelling, right? You're feeling the emotions connected with the story and the lives lost and all this stuff, but that's on one level. I'm saying this now as a history fan. I think some other people don't like history because they connect with it on a more visceral level. I think maybe the fact that I'm able to divorce myself is what makes the story interesting, right? If it were too real, you might not want to be so interested. But now let me take it to the too real area for a minute. As a journalist, I always wanted to be a war correspondent until I wised up and realized how stupid that would be. So I realized how stupid it would be because some of my heroes were war correspondents, and I would read what they wrote. Some of the most disturbing books I've ever read in my life are those books. One of them is a perfect example. It's called The Great War for Civilization by Robert Fisk, who is a war correspondent, a modern war correspondent. The stuff that is in Robert Fisk's memory banks, in his brain, are horrific. And when he writes this stuff in the book, I'm a guy who reads Mongol conquest stories for fun at bedtime and never think twice about it. This was one of the few books I had to put down and make sure that I had some mental sorbet to cleanse my palate before bed, because I could not get it out of my brain. Because what he was essentially doing was giving you the kind of reporting you would have had on the scene at a conquest, like, Baghdad, or a tiny little sliver of a slice of one out-of-the-way corner of Baghdad. And it is so visceral and it is so real, it makes you sick. It gives you a sick-to-your-stomach feel. And that's the feeling you would have if you could get closer to those historical events. And that's what leaches out, so that when we read it later, it's compelling reading and interesting reading. I always say, I wonder how the people at the time period would feel about finding out that we're interested in those horrible moments in their lives in an almost entertainment-like fashion. And the only thing that makes me feel okay about it is that I realize that they enjoyed stories from the past just like I do. And it seems to be a guilty pleasure we all share. And now with our modern coronavirus, we're getting a chance to pay a little bit for how much we've enjoyed those kind of stories in the past by providing some for future generations that hopefully will arrive sometime to read about it later.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. I definitely don't want anything bad to happen here with coronavirus. I wish the best for everyone, so I need to get that disclaimer. Having said that, what this process will do is, I think, connect us with our ancestors in a way that it'd be impossible to imagine otherwise, since plagues are such a common reoccurring thing that happen over and over again. So now we get a little taste of what that's like.
I'm actually having that exact same emotion, and I was trying to cut a show this morning, one of my political shows I haven't done in a while. I've been trying to do it, and this is one of the thoughts that came out, which is, in a funny way, this allows us to have a little bit of an understanding of what it's like. You had mentioned the disease part, but for me, I'm feeling like we're getting a chance. Let me back up. This is the best way to do it. I did a show once on the second Red Scare, the communist era, 50s scare and the whole thing. And I talked about how when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s and we studied that period, it just looked insane. It didn't make any sense. You couldn't write about it in a history book in a way where we would sit there and go, oh, yeah, I see why it was that way. And it's because there's lots of periods in history where you get to call it a mass psychosis is not the right word, but it generates the right sort of image in your head where it's almost like a crazy period, but you can't understand it from outside the period. And we said, wouldn't it be nice if you had like a potion that you could drink that would allow you to have the same fears, the same level of uncertainty, all that thing of the period that you wanted to study, and then you drink it, and then all of a sudden you go, oh, I see why they felt this way. Well, I feel like going through what we're going through now, and it's much bigger than the coronavirus thing. It's everything we've been dealing with for the last couple of years. I feel like you're getting a chance to drink that potion, and you're going, oh, I see what this feels like to live in an irrational era where everything seems a little nuts and where your kids or grandchildren are going to read the history books about the 2020s and think, why were they so crazy? I don't understand that period. But that happens over and over again. So when you say this is sort of like the devil's advocate looking at the bright side of the things we're going through, but I do feel like it's helped me on a personal level understand a few things about the past a little bit better.
Right. I like to think it'll be called the Great Toilet Paper Scare of 2020. That, no, we're not stocking up on food. We're stocking up on toilet paper. And
you're hoping it's not the Great Toilet Paper Crisis of 2020, in which case you probably don't have enough. And some people are going to be making a killing. The toilet paper, it'll be like the Carnegies and the Rothschilds. And it's toilet paper money. You'll hear people say that years from now. Oh, they come from toilet paper money.
We've moved to a full prison economy where it's toilet paper, cigarettes, and a few other things too.
My wife said to me, she goes, how much money should we have out of the bank? I said, honey, if it gets to a certain point, this ain't going to be about money. It's going to be about, do you have any butter? What else do you have? We're going to be just trading.
It's exactly like prison. It's exactly how the economy works.
Exactly like prison. That's right. The national prison economy.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that things that look ridiculous back then of communist scares and whatever that film was in the 50s was I Married a Commie, I Married a Communist. And one time I was looking at German propaganda, and a question that came up with is how did the most educated society on earth in the 1930s, Germany, fall for what looks like so crude pictures and images of Jewish people with fangs looking like vampires, and then being able to transition yourself in that period? It could somehow make sense, like you mentioned with the potion. And kind of with that, I want to jump into the 20th century because this is something else that your book focuses on, where you're connecting ancient fears to modern day fears. And that's how we can bridge these two eras and get more empathy for how people in the past would have acted. So you talk a lot about nuclear scares and common themes with the nuclear age and those in the ancient past. So what were some of those things that you saw?
I'm not sure which common themes we're talking about.
Well, you mentioned the...
It's been a while since I've read the book, man.
That happens exactly to me, too. Once I'm done with something, yeah, it's gone.
I'm trying to remember what I said.
Okay, well, here's one specifically that I really liked. You mentioned the 1960 presidential election with Nixon and Kennedy, where this is a few years before the Cuban Missile Crisis. The doomsday clock is about as close as it could ever be. And the main issue that people have is, for voting, John F. Kennedy looks right at the camera when he debates, and he has better coiffed hair.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm there. I see it now. All right. Well, isn't it funny how that's always the case? It has to do with not being able to maintain the level of, I guess the best way that we phrased it is, if we were asking you what level of attention something requires of you, where would you put nuclear war on the list, right? If you were triaging the important things for you to be concerned with. Well, I mean, in a world where everything is equal, you would put nuclear war probably as number one, certainly like top three, right? Certainly on your triage list of concerns. But is it logical to expect human beings to be able to sit with absolute focus and purpose and paying attention to that at the expense of all the other banal concerns that make up our collective lives forever? I mean, we had used the metaphor in the podcast that we did on nuclear, early nuclear development as all of us having a gun pointed at our head all the time. And the generation that remembers living without a gun pointed to their head might have constantly known it was there. But what happens when you're 3 generations into people that have never known anything but that? Right? Can you properly give the attention that it deserves if it's something that's always been a part of your life? Yeah, nuclear war might happen, but my taxes went up $500 this year, and that affects me more right now. That almost is, again, you and I had talked earlier in this discussion about sort of the evolutionary side of some of this stuff. And I do wonder whether or not our ability to forget enormous potential threats is